of populism and authoritarian regimes and the fight against them. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the Hungarian European Society and to Ibis for inviting me, and it's a great pleasure to be here in Budapest. Again, quite frankly, any excuse to come to Budapest is something that I'll take. I want to start with, there was a famous obscenity trial in the United States, and it involved a judge who was asked by the lawyer for the makers of pornographic film whether what actually counted as obscene content, because obscene content was not protected by the First Amendment of the American Constitution. And after, as the question went back and forth, he then said, well, I know it when I see it. And it's a bit like this when we're talking about illiberal democracies, hybrid regimes, semi-authoritarianism, populism. We can throw these terms around, but we all know it when we see it. And I want to talk not so much about definitions, but I want to talk about the strategies and the ideological strategy they use, and why this has proven so difficult for liberals to get a handle on. And I think I've got 4 sections here. I'm going to talk about how we see liberalism as a kind of truth exercise. I'm going to talk about how they attack the process of formation of knowledge and truth and consensus in society. I'm going to talk about democracy as a contest for power. And finally, I'm going to ask, how is this fair? And suggest that what the best name for these kind of regimes are political monopolies. Think of like an economic market where you seem to be able to have competition, but somehow one side always wins. Somehow one side always seems to win elections here. Somehow you can set up an independent newspaper, and it's much harder to make money out of doing it than if you get the government subsidies, and so on. So what do I mean, first of all, by this liberalism of truth? If we go back, really from the Enlightenment onwards, we've been sort of struggling about how to replace God in social organization. How do we think about what's right and wrong, what are good political institutions, and in various different versions, starting with Kant, maybe going on to the utilitarians in England, or even Habermas, who was mentioned earlier. We try and find objective justifications for a more or less liberal organization of society. And we tend to think, therefore, that because we think they're objective justifications, everyone else is also going to think they're objective justifications. And we got a little bit complacent. Because after 1989, we got out of the habit of contesting other types of justification for how to organize society. Liberals throughout the 20th century had to deal with monarchism at the beginning of the 20th century, they had to deal with fascism, they had to deal with communism, so they were pretty good at defending liberalism as an ideological system. But after 1989, we kind of stopped. We sort of said, no, liberalism is what works. You had these really boring kind of politics from the third way that would say, we are interested in policies that work. We want to talk about issues that matter to people. We want to do the right thing for our society. Great, but what do you mean by that? And I understand it, of course, as political rhetoric. Maybe you want to create an illusory consensus among people who may or may not agree with you, and that's fine as a tactic. But we got out of the habit of actually disagreeing and actually persuading and actually making arguments for liberal democracy as a system. And this has become a particular problem since 2008 because we relied on liberalism working. And we said, ours is the best system, it gives prosperity, it gives freedom, it gives all these good things. So really there shouldn't be any competition to our system. And then we had this massive crisis. And suddenly our system stopped giving prosperity, it appeared. It looked like it gave volatility. Hungary was one of the countries, of course, most strongly hit by the 2008 crisis, but we saw a similar situation in Greece, for example, where you had far-left populism rather than far-right populism. But you had, similarly, you had a reaction against the consensus. And you began to see an attack on liberalism, not just for being rubbish, but also for somehow being a power structure designed to push away other forms of political organization. They would say, well, here you have all this foreign influence. You're not really a real autochthonous native organisation. You've got foreign funding, which is why you have all this foreign funding laws. Now we might say that one person's foreign funding is someone else's badge of international acceptability. So it's not sure that tactic necessarily worked, but there's this sense that what they're suddenly trying to do is delegitimize liberalism's answers to the problems of society. Not necessarily say they're wrong, but to say they're corrupt, they're considered illegitimately arrived at. We had another example from the Brexit referendum, where academics who would perform completely impartial analysis of the economic effects of Brexit would suddenly find themselves attacked for receiving EU money, as if the European Union research grants functioned like these transactional propaganda tricks that Charlotte was talking about before. They were immediately said, but you're paid by the European Commission. And they weren't used to that, so they couldn't respond. What we have, but ultimately, there's a lot of truth in this attack. Liberalism actually is a power structure. It's a political ideology. It's as power structures go, it allows an awful lot of freedom. It allows people to do many more things than competing power structures do. And that's one of the strongest arguments actually in favor of liberalism. But liberalism is not, despite what philosophers like John Rawls said, neutral. It does not achieve, despite what Habermas might say, a consensus in society. It is a series of political institutions designed to allow the flourishing of a certain kind of society. And if you have a different kind of society in mind, if you're a serious Catholic anti-Christ of the French style in the 19th century, you won't like liberal societies. You'll criticize it. You'll think, no, I actually think God has a lot more to tell us about how we should live. God tells me that LGBT relationships are bad, and you want in your society to advocate that position. And in a democracy, don't you have the right to do that? Yet liberalism has gone increasingly in the other direction. It's saying, well, hold on a minute, these things aren't your religious views, they might be considered hate speech. Where does that debate then take place? So the enemies of liberalism can use all this to say, no, you're actually a power structure, you're actually supported by, I don't know, I'll pick some of the people who donate to my organizations, because supported by the GMF. That is one of the funders of Unhack democracy. So people, we get accused and delegitimized constantly. And the mistake is, instead of rolling with it and saying, sure, there are political battles around here, we're having a political debate, we try and spend too much time trying to either not mention the situation. I know people who, for example, tried not to get funding from the OSF because they were afraid they'd get attacked. So what? You get attacked by them. That's part of life. Your enemies are going to attack you. You don't have to necessarily be completely impartial to anything. You're allowed to be supported by your friends and by your allies. The United States is doing a great job, by the way, supporting an event like this, standing for the great values of the American Republic, for democracy, for freedom, for open debate. But so if the illiberals are attacking us for being a power structure, we need to think about where they're vulnerable. Because they're vulnerable not on the liberal side of things, but on their idea of democracy. Because there obviously is many ways to conceive of democracy as there are grains of sand on a beach, but one of the ways you can think about democracy is a contest for political power. It's a way of choosing who gets to rule over us. And it's a better method of choosing who gets to rule over us than other things that have been tried in the past, like hereditary succession or competing military forces. And it works at two levels. On the one hand, it works about the contest for the right to rule. Who gets to pass orderly legislation, enact government policies? But it also happens at a second level, the constitutional level, the right to set the rules of the game. And the weakness in illiberal democracy is it doesn't make a distinction between these two levels. It tries to say, well, as long as we've been elected legitimately according to whatever procedures are in place, that means we can then change the rules again. And we've been given a mandate from the people not just to work within a political system, to hold a particular political office, but we've been given a mandate to change everything, rename the country, create a whole new kind of system, not even call it a constitution, but call it a series of cardinal fundamental laws, to pick an example entirely at random. Because they don't distinguish that, they're actually vulnerable to an attack of unfairness. It's not just that you're saying, we Fidesz have won a majority so we can then govern. They want to explicitly change the system in a way that many Hungarians are actually pretty uncomfortable with. And the way I would want to describe this then is this idea of political monopoly. Because if you look at competition law and competition economics, you have a lot of concepts that help us distinguish between ordinary market operations. So I'm making a product and I make a better product than everyone else, and as a result I happen to dominate the market. Or even, I don't necessarily make a better product, but I'm just better at marketing it and I have a better advertising campaign. That's also fine in ordinary capitalism. What's not fine is trying to buy up all my competitors so they can't build any better products than my own. What's not fine is saying, like Nespresso tried to do this but didn't get away with it because we've got competition laws, but they say, we've got our special coffee pods. And our coffee pods are quite expensive. We do the same thing people do with razor blades. You can have a cheap coffee machine and then expensive pods, and that's how they hope to make their money back. But what they're not allowed to do is stop anyone else making compatible pods. So there's an open market there, and Nespresso can market it. They can say only these ones are the real legitimate ones, but they're not able to completely kill the rest of the market. But what a political monopolist tries to do is make this shift. They want to move from a system where there's a fair competition of power to one where there's an unfair competition of power. And this allows us to start to contest these regimes, not on the grounds of them not being liberal, because that's what the debate is about. We're disagreeing with them about how to organize society. But because they have a concept of democracy that is incredibly simplistic, that doesn't allow people to change their minds, because they then find that they've made a decision once and then the next decision isn't on the same basis. It allows, and this allows us to be able to say, well, what we're really fighting about is the nature of democracy, real democracy, and to then turn the tables. Instead of them accusing us of being a power structure, we can start saying, you're not proper Democrats. You say you're Democrats, but you're not really. Because they like to think that they're Democrats. They openly say they're illiberals, so if we criticize them for being a liberal, they'll say, yeah, sure, we're not. We have no intention of being liberal. You're absolutely right, we disagree with you on that. Whereas if you criticize them for being Democrats, they're suddenly on the defensive. They have to explain why it's totally okay to change the rules each time. And they will say things like, oh, well, we got a constitutional majority under the last thing. And you will say, well, that's just the technical legal things. What about, why do you have democratic legitimacy? You have democratic legitimacy because people get a fair chance to choose who their leader is. But they don't if you only give the opposition candidate 5 minutes on national television. And government ministers get, well, whatever the total amount of time minus 5 minutes is. You don't if... speaking of the total amount of time, I'll finish up there, but basically say we need to, and we have the tools to be able to show why this kind of fake democracy isn't just illiberal, which of course we believe in, but also fakely democratic.